Welcome to Stubborn Fury, a place for quiet stories and slower nights. No noise. No rush, just gentle tales to help you unwind. Let's begin. It's mid-morning in Thebes. Around 1250 BCE, the sun has climbed far enough to paint the banks of the Nile with golden warmth, but not yet high enough to make standing in it unbearable. You are walking toward the river with a worn reed basket tucked under your arm, filled with clothes, linens, and a handful of hand-woven cloths you'll need for tomorrow's temple market. Laundry in ancient Egypt wasn't just a task, it was a ritual of domestic survival. It was also a surprisingly public affair. Near the water's edge, dozens of people are already gathering. Women of all ages and a few men stand knee-deep in the shallows, slapping garments rhythmically against large, smooth stones. Some used soft sand and Egypt's natural soda ash to scrub particularly soiled areas. Others use wooden paddles to beat stubborn stains from fabric in a motion that looks both meditative and brutal. No washing machines, no detergent pods, just the river, sun, and patience nearby. Children splash and shout, momentarily distracting their mothers from the rhythm of work. A boy tries to catch a fish with a woven reed trap. An older girl, about 9 or 10, laughs while helping her aunt wring out a tunic dyed with faded ochre. Despite the sun, the scene isn't quiet, but it is calming in its own way. The sloshing of water, low chatter in ancient Egyptian, and the thump-thump of wet fabric against rock combine to form the lullaby of a civilization's daily upkeep. Ancient Egyptian society, as rigid and hierarchical as it was, left certain roles to be shared by all. Laundry, for instance, knew no class boundaries. Even nobles needed clean linen robes. Most upper-class families had servants to do the work, but they too would send them to the banks of the Nile, mingling with the poor and merchant classes. So, laundry day was both a chore and a rare equalizer. Water was sacred to Egyptians. The Nile wasn't just a source of life, it was the artery of the kingdom. Washing clothes in it wasn't merely practical, it was spiritually significant. Some even whispered quiet prayers while rinsing temple cloths, hoping the gods of the river would carry away the stain of human imperfections. Occasionally, priests might walk the banks, observing or blessing garments meant for religious use. Even the pharaoh's robes, if not laundered by temple assistants, would begin their journey here beaten on rocks, rinsed in silt-heavy waters, and hung on sun-bleached cords strung between date palms. But of course, it wasn't always so serene. Disputes could erupt over rock space. A merchant's wife might scold a neighbor for letting dye-stained water spill toward her white linen. A child might kick sand into a basin meant for temple use, and more than once, crocodiles had been spotted lurking farther downriver, sending shrieks and baskets flying as the group scattered in every direction. Still, they always came back, and behind it all, there was the quiet anxiety of preservation. Fabric was valuable, linen was costly, the Nile was generous, but a missed garment floating away downstream could mean a week without proper dress, or a harsh reprimand from one's employer. Each person washed with the tension of care, not too rough to tear the fibers, not too soft to leave stains behind. Some, you notice, have brought homemade brushes, bundles of fibrous palm tied with rope. Others use their feet to stomp out heavy mats like winemakers treading grapes. In the shade of a sycamore, an elderly woman sings a slow, tuneless chant. You can't quite understand all the words, it's likely a local household spell, but you hear references to the gods of white cloth and the enemies of rot. Perhaps it's an invocation for stain-free garments, or maybe a prayer that the linen won't tear in tomorrow's heat. And yet, as you rinse your final tunic and stretch it gently across a rope, you can't help but wonder, how did such a crucial task, one soaked in ritual and necessity, slowly vanish from memory, replaced by machines and detergents, far from the riverbanks and community it once drew together? As the sun climbs higher above the Nile, shadows retreat and the quiet rhythms of laundry day begin to shift. The riverbanks grow busier. Early arrivals have finished washing and are now preoccupied with the art of drying an equally delicate process that reveals much more than one might think about the social fabric of ancient Egyptian life. You step away from the water with your damp bundle, careful not to drag it through the dust. A long rope strung between two acacia trees offers the perfect place to hang your linens. But you hesitate for a moment. Space is limited, and territory is quietly, firmly claimed. No words are exchanged, but the subtle glances and elbow placements speak volumes. In this moment, you are not just airing out clothing. You are making a public statement about your household, your cleanliness and your attention to ritual. It's like hanging your status out to dry. White linen was the clothing of choice for almost everyone in ancient Egypt, from farmers to nobles. But not all linen was created equal. The finer the weave, the more prestige it carried. High-status families often had linen so sheer and tightly woven that it looked like glass under sunlight. Thicker linens, coarser to the touch, were practical and durable, but they whispered of lower social rank. As you hang each item, you smooth it out with care. Creases weren't just unsightly, they were interpreted in some circles as spiritual disorder. Wrinkles, after all, could disrupt the flow of mat, the principle of balance and harmony that governed every Egyptian life. Nearby, a young man barefoot and shirtless, with a sun-darkened back, carefully brushes down a nobleman's robe using a flat stick. He's a laundry worker from a servant class, but his movements are deliberate, almost reverent. These garments are to be worn during a festival at the temple of Karnak tomorrow. One loose thread, one unseen stain, and he could be punished for negligence. Drying lines sag under the weight of wet tunics and sashes. In the distance, you see woven mats laid out on low stone platforms, drying slower under a shaded canopy. This isn't just convenience, it's strategy. Drying too fast can stiffen the cloth or bleach it unevenly. Some families believe that shaded drying preserves the blessings woven into the threads by temple artisans. A grandmother scolds her granddaughter for wringing a sash too harshly. You're wringing out the gods. With the water, she snaps, half joking, half serious. For all their practicality, ancient Egyptians were deeply spiritual people. Many believed that everyday tasks like laundry could be acts of ritual, infused with gratitude to divine forces who govern water, labor, and fabric. Washing was also a gendered performance, but not an exclusive one. While women led most household chores, men were often involved in laundry, especially those tied to temple duties or army garrisons. After all, the linen used for embalming mummies, wrapping sacred statues, or dressing priests needed care beyond the everyday. Some scribes even kept records, yes, records of laundry loads. Temple laundries maintained lists of robes, cloths, altar coverings, and their washing cycles. Specific garments required purification in natron, followed by a set number of rinses, and then drying in a place untouched by common feet. If you were a temple launderer, your job was more priestly than practical. But not all stories from these banks were so sacred. A woman a few yards away mutters under her breath. She holds a tunic stained with an unidentifiable yellow patch. Someone, she suspects, has sabotaged it. Jealousy perhaps, or vengeance. Ruined fabric could mean public embarrassment, or the end of a merchant's credibility. Laundering had its rivalries. The best launderers were hired by wealthier families, and competition could be fierce. Whispers of spoiled natron, accidental tears, or bad drying spots were common. You even recall a tale from last festival season to laundresses accused each other of stealing the other's best robe. The local judge had to mediate over laundry twine. The midday heat deepens. The soundscape shifts. Now, instead of thumping and sloshing, the air is filled with flapping linen rustling gently in the wind, drying inch by inch. Some women sit under makeshift canopies, weaving or sewing. Others trade dried garments for fresh ones brought by passing family members. The cycle never ends, and yet in this repetition there is structure, a quiet order amid chaos. You glance across the rows of gently swaying cloth and wonder. How did this intricate, ritualized dance of river, linen, and labor influence Egyptian identity, and how much of it was lost when the washing moved away from the riverbanks and into back rooms and basins? The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the Nile's banks. The river Once bustling with washerwomen, children, and servants, begins to return to silence. The sounds of slapping fabric, laughter, and quiet dispute now fade into the rhythmic hum of cicadas and the soft murmur of water against stone. The drying lines are mostly bare. You see only a few garments left, fluttering gently like prayer flags, white linen strips glowing gold in the sun's last stretch. The laundry is done. And yet, the story of laundry in ancient Egypt does not end here. In fact, it continues just in quieter, more symbolic places. You walk back toward the village, basket now empty except for a few folded tunics and a damp cloth too delicate to dry fully. As you pass a cluster of homes, you catch sight of a different kind of laundry, a long strip of linen being carefully ironed using a smooth river stone warmed in the sun. The woman doing it doesn't speak. Her hands move with slow, practiced care. This isn't everyday clothing. This is burial linen. In ancient Egypt, death was not a full stop, it was a process. And clean linen played a key role in that process. Not just for the dead, but for the living who prepared them. From humble villagers to wealthy nobles, every Egyptian hoped to be buried in properly laundered cloth. To be wrapped in dirty linen was to risk spiritual offense, to deny the gods the respect they required. The Book of the Dead, filled with spells to guide souls through the afterlife, often referenced the clean linen of the righteous. Laundry wasn't just hygiene. It was purity. It was passage. It was eternal readiness. In temple complexes, specialist laundry workers were often seen as semi-sacred. Their role cleaning the sacred cloths used in rituals and embalming blurred the line between domestic and divine. These weren't just robes or altar coverings. They were physical representations of Mot, the divine order of the universe. Over time, temple laundries became centers of their own, holding inventory, managing water use, maintaining cloth purity. The washer of the divine linen was an official title and even recorded on tomb walls. Yet by the time of the late dynasties, laundry, at least the public, riverbank kind, began to change. With the rise of cities like Alexandria and the growing influence of Greek customs, daily laundry began to shift behind courtyard walls. Families with means installed private basins. Public laundering became more associated with servants or lower status laborers. The ritual aspects began to fade. The singing stopped. The sacred washing spells were forgotten. By the Roman period in Egypt, the once vital art of community washing along the Nile had become just another labor, task efficient, private, unremarkable. And then came the machines. Thousands of years later, the rhythm of laundry would move from riverbanks to laundromats, or to whirring units behind closed doors, fast, frictionless, forgotten still. If you listen closely on a quiet day, as you wash a shirt or fold a sheet, perhaps you can feel something older in your fingertips. The memory of sun-warmed stone, the pressure of pulling out a stubborn stain, the hush of a community bound not by wealth or words, but by water and cloth. And so, the next time you empty your washer, or tug a shirt from a drying rack, you might remember this. What else in our everyday lives was once sacred, performed with prayer, conducted with care, and offered to the gods of routine? And what do we lose, not in forgetting the work, but in forgetting that it ever mattered? It's dawn over Lake Xochimilco, sometime around the early 1400s CE. The sky is streaked with pale rose and violet. You're on a canoe, gliding silently over calm waters. Mist hovers above the lake like a ghostly veil, but ahead you can make out long, narrow islands, man-made, low to the water, bursting with green life. These are Chinampas, the floating gardens of the Aztec Empire. They look like pieces of solid earth gently drifting over the water's surface. But they don't drift. They're anchored, rooted, and they hold the secret to feeding a civilization of millions. You nudge the canoe alongside one of them. It's about 30 feet wide and a few hundred feet long. On it, maize plants stand in rows, thick with promise. Squash vines tangle near the edges, and beanstalks twirl upward along slender stakes. The garden is humming, not with noise but with energy, life, growth, and all without a patch of dry land in sight. This you soon learn. is what made the Aztecs extraordinary not just as warriors and builders but as agricultural innovators. Chiampas weren't actual rafts, they were artificial islands, built using a technique that dated back to earliest civilizations in the Valley of Mexico, like the Xochimilco and Teotihuacanos. The Aztecs didn't invent them, but they perfected them. Here's how they worked. First, a shallow area of lake bed was selected. Wooden stakes were hammered into a rectangle to form the outline of the chinampa. Into this frame went layers-thick mats of water plants, reeds, aquatic weeds like tuile and a hottle, and finally, silt dredged from the lake bottom. This silt was rich, dark, and oozy, filled with nutrients from centuries of decay. Each layer compacted the last, and within days, a muddy platform began to take shape. Over time, the gardeners planted willows along the edges of hedge oats whose roots reached down and helped anchor the structure to the lake bed. Soon, you had a rectangle of land that looked and functioned like regular soil, except it was surrounded by water. Irrigation happened naturally. Water could be drawn from canals with a single gourd scoop. Nutrients flowed continuously upward from the lake through the saturated base. These floating fields weren't just clever, they were efficient. A single chinampa could yield multiple harvests per year, sometimes up to 7. Corn, tomatoes, chilies, beans, amaranth, herbs, and flowers were grown in abundance. The Aztecs had, in effect, invented a form of hydroponic farming centuries before the word existed. You walk along the edge of the chinampa, balancing carefully on its narrow border. The mud is firm beneath your feet, though the water laps gently against the sides. A farmer at Chinampaneko is ahead, bent at the waist, gently tending to a row of tlaxcali plants. He's humming something soft and rhythmic. You can't quite catch the words, but it sounds like a planting song, something passed down through families like a secret spell. Each chinampa had its guardian. These men and women knew the rhythm of the lake, the moods of the soil. They understood when to dredge more mud, when to rotate crops, when to let a plot rest beneath reeds for a season to rebuild its strength. But this wasn't just subsistence farming. The produce from the chinampas helped sustain the heart of the Empire Tenochtitlan. That immense island city, home to perhaps 100,000 people, relied on the chinampas to feed its markets, temples, and armies. Without them, the city would have starved. You pass a canal-side storage hut, little more than woven walls and a reed roof. Inside, baskets of harvested maize are stacked beside bundles of beans, tied with twine. This, too, is part of the chinampa system. Food ready for transport via canoe to the Tiongui, the bustling Aztec marketplace. As the sun rises, more canoes appear. Some carry tools, others bring workers. A few bring children who jump from boat to bank, laughing, their feet already coated in black mud. They're being trained, even now, in the quiet mastery of this floating world. It is all so delicate, so intricate, and yet so easily overlooked. The Spanish would later dismiss these gardens as curiosities. Many were destroyed or abandoned after the conquest, replaced by more European methods of farming. And yet, chinampas had fed millions, silently, without fanfare. And so, standing here, surrounded by water and green, you ask yourself, why does innovation that sustains us often go unnoticed, lost to time, until the land itself forgets how it once fed us? Midday has arrived, and the sun hangs high above Lake Xochimilco. From your vantage point on a narrow chinampa, the stillness of the water below contrasts with the quiet bustle above it. The scene is serene but industrious, an entire hidden economy in motion, powered not by conquest or ceremony but by dirt, mud, and quiet dedication. The deeper you look, the more you realize these gardens were not simply about growing food. They were the root system of a civilization. Beneath every leaf of maize, behind every layer of mud, was a careful choreography of engineering, ecology, and spiritual belief. Let's begin with the canals. The narrow waterways between chinampas weren't just for transport. They were part of a finely balanced water management system. When rainfall was heavy or lake levels rose, excess water could be drained off into designated channels. During dry periods, Water could be guided into chinampa beds using handmade sluices. It was controlled flooding, a partnership with the lake, not a conquest of it. And these weren't isolated islands. Chinampas formed a vast archipelago of productivity, spreading across the shallow lakes in orderly grids, divided by canoe paths like streets in a city. Surveyors laid them out with care. In some places, they were so tightly packed, they created what looked like solid ground from a distance. But this was no coincidence. Aztec agriculture was tightly organized, and the chinampa system was part of a broader imperial strategy. Tribute lists from the Codex Mendoza show that regions around Lake Xochimilco were responsible for sending vast quantities of produce to Tenochtitlan on a strict schedule. Tomatoes, maize, chilies, avocados, herbs all grown in water and delivered. By paddle. The state knew exactly how many baskets were due. Farmers were inspected. Even the spacing of rows and rotation of crops was sometimes supervised. It wasn't tyranny, it was efficiency. The empire relied on these gardens for daily function. Without chinampas, there could be no imperial banquets, no market bustle, no soldiers' rations. But the gardens didn't just grow food. They grew flowers. In fact, floriculture was a major part of chinampa life. Marigolds, dahlias, and other vibrant blooms were cultivated for use in rituals, temple offerings, and even medicinal practices. Some Chinampanacos specialized in flower farming. Their plots shimmered in color, lining the lake with reds, oranges, and pinks. These flowers weren't decorative, they were sacred. And sacredness was woven into every layer of the chinampa. The Aztecs believed in the balance of nature and human labor. They didn't farm to dominate nature. They farmed within it. Deities such as Tlaloc, the rain god, and Chiquimecotl, goddess of maize, were regularly honored with offerings from these gardens. Small shrines dotted the corners of chinampas. Some had feathers, others dried corn husks or tiny clay effigies. Occasionally, before planting a new season's crop, a farmer would bury a fish or bird beneath the soil as a gift to the earth. Not because it made the soil richer, though it probably did, but because it honored the spirits thought to dwell within the lake bed. You pause now by one such corner. A simple clay jar is half buried beneath a willow. It's cracked from age. Inside, you see dried petals, a bundle of herbs, and what looks like a tiny carving of a frog, a child's offering, or a farmer's quiet prayer for rain. And yet, life here wasn't idyllic. The chinampas had enemies, natural and political. Heavy storms could wash away entire beds. Water hyacinth, an invasive plant, could choke the canals and ruin circulation. And as the empire expanded, demands grew. Some chinampa workers began to feel pressure: more crops, less rest, tighter schedules. If a harvest failed, the entire local kalpali, the social unit, might suffer. In times of war, male workers were drafted as porters or soldiers, leaving fields untended. Some chinampas were abandoned temporarily, others permanently. Water would reclaim them slowly, like a forgotten promise. Still, the system endured. Century after century, even after the arrival of the Spanish, when much of Aztec society crumbled under plague, war, and forced labor, the chinampas lingered. Locals returned to them quietly. They planted corn as their ancestors had, sang planting songs under their breath. Some chinampas survived into the 1800s. A few still remain today, fragile ghosts of their former scale, near Mexico City's southern limits. As you rest on the edge of the garden, letting your feet dangle into the cool water, a single question comes to mind. How did a system so effective, so sustainable, and so elegant in its simplicity become sidelined, buried beneath concrete and convenience? The sun is setting now, low and amber, casting the chinampas in a honeyed glow. The lake has grown quiet again. Canoes have returned to shore. Crops sit still, almost reverent in their rows. And the floating gardens, so alive only hours ago, now seem timeless, almost ancient in their silence. You are still on the edge of a chinampa, though now it feels like a raft through memory. The longer you sit, the more you realize that what the Aztecs built here wasn't just a method of farming. It was a worldview made visible. And yet, Like so many indigenous innovations, it was quietly unmade. The Spanish, when they arrived in the early 16th century, were astonished by the chinampas. Some called them miracles. Others feared them as unnatural, but few truly understood them. To European eyes, agriculture belonged on terra firma. Fields were to be ploughed, not floated, and so, slowly, deliberately, the chinampa system was dismantled. Much of it wasn't done with malice, just misunderstanding. Canals were drained to make space for roads. The city of Tenochtitlan was reshaped into colonial Mexico City. Wetlands were filled. Lakes dried. What had once been a thriving aquatic metropolis was turned into dry, dust-prone land. The garden